We will be hosting monthly webinars on occupational and environmental health topics, and they will be on the first Wednesday of each month at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I would just like to say that CE Continuing Education Credit is available for participating in this webinar. If you haven't already registered and would like CE credits, please register again at coehce.org. If you are taking this webinar for credit, please complete an evaluation, which you will be emailed in your confirmation for registration. After today, the webinar will be archived and a link will be at coehce.org. However, the archived video is for continuing education credit only, so if you wish to view it, it will be a $30 fee to view the webinar after today. This webinar is for educational purposes only, and it's not to be reproduced or represented without permission. Just a little housekeeping for today. You will be muted during this presentation. So if you would like to ask a question, please enter it into the online chat that you see at the bottom of your screen, and we will collect the questions, and at the completion of the presentation, we'll spend 5 to 10 minutes in Q&A. So at this time, I'm pleased to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Carisa Harris-Adamson. She is going to present to us the latest research on sit-stand workstations. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine at UC San Francisco and in the School of Public Health at UC Berkeley, and the director of the UCSF UC Berkeley Ergonomics Research and Graduate Training Program. Dr. Harris's current research ranges from epidemiological studies on healthy worker survivor bias to assessment of physical, personal, and work psychosocial factors associated with carpal tunnel. And she collaborates on numerous other projects at the UC Ergonomics Lab. So we are very, very pleased today to have Dr. Harris-Adamson present this topic to us. At this time, I would like to hand over to our presenter for today.
Thanks, Julia, for the introduction, and I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Today I'm going to be talking about the research for common health risks that result from prolonged static sitting and standing work. I will also be summarizing some of the key points on the latest research regarding sit-stand workstations. I'll identify some of the best practices from the literature for the use of sit-stand workstations, and we'll also touch on some areas for further research. So, why do we sit? Let's start by discussing why it's important to sit at all. Well, prolonged standing is uncomfortable. Numerous studies have shown that low back discomfort is associated with standing more than 50% of the work shift. A study by Engels et al. On nurses found a 3- to 5-fold increase in odds of having low back or lower extremity pain with standing. A study of bank tellers also reported more discomfort in the low back with standing compared to sitting or even perching. And more recently, a study by Anderson et al. That looked at more than 5,600 industrial or service workers over a 24-month period found a 2-fold increase in low back and or extremity pain for those who stood more than 30 minutes per hour. A recent study by Garcia simulated 5 hours of standing work with 5-minute breaks, measuring muscle twitch force and subjective assessment of fatigue in the legs. Standing led to subjective reported fatigue in the legs and hips and knees that was verified by a reduction of muscle twitch force that persisted for 30 minutes after the standing work ceased. Additionally, prolonged static standing is also associated with cardiovascular concerns, including increased leg volume, increased risk of atherosclerosis, and varicose veins. A paper by Waters and Dick summarized the health risks associated with prolonged standing quite nicely. Based on the literature, they summarized that there is ample evidence that prolonged standing leads to numerous negative health outcomes, including low back and leg discomfort, physical fatigue, leg swelling, increased risk of cardiovascular problems, and even increased risk for adverse pregnancy outcomes, such as preterm births and low birth weight. Additionally, the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety has suggested that standing workers change their working positions frequently and are allowed suitable rest periods. Other organizations like the Occupational Health and Safety Council of Ontario have defined prolonged standing as standing on a hard surface for more than 4 hours per day. And an article in the Netherlands presented a stoplight model for standing and identifies continuous standing more than 1 hour per day or standing more than a total of 4 hours. So why do we sit? Well, it's comfortable and a necessary break from prolonged standing. We know a lot about how different sitting postures and chair features affect fatigue and comfort. For example, we know that having arms supported with armrests and increasing the backrest inclination reduces compressive forces on the discs and decreases muscle activity of the rectus sinae. We also know that static durations of muscle activity between 5 and 10% MVC can produce signs of muscle fatigue due to a few individual motor units being recruited first that stay active until the muscles provided a period of rest. Cinderella fibers that perform a disproportionate amount of the work require a rest break. So, why all the controversy about sitting? I'm sure you've heard in the media, sitting is the new smoking, but what else is there? What do they potentially leave out? Although sitting is a great way to recover from prolonged standing, too much of it presents its own risks, and the number of hours that we sit has increased both in leisure time and during work over the decades. And here it is worth noting that studies looking at the association between total sitting time and cardiovascular disease have found a 50% to twofold increase in risk associated with those who spend more than 9 to 10 hours a day. That time includes work time, commuting time, and leisure time sitting. It's also worth noting that studies that have looked at the association between occupational sitting time and cardiovascular disease have not found an association, with all the hazard ratios being close to 1. In fact, a meta-analysis by Lee in 2013 found that those engaged in high occupational activity had increased risk of cardiovascular disease compared to those with low occupational physical activity. That same study found that a moderate to increase in leisure time physical activity decreased the risk of cardiovascular disease by 20 to 30%, and high leisure time physical activity decreased the risk of cardiovascular disease by 30 to 40%. However, it appears that we really need to look at both the total sitting time and leisure time physical activity to understand the impact on worker health. A study by Vanderploeg in 2012 looked at the number of hours of sitting per day and the duration of physical activity in minutes per week. Although increasing physical activity time per week did reduce risk of deaths per 1,000 person years in any individual category of sitting, you can see that there is still an increase in risk with increased sitting time within any category of physical activity, particularly those who sit more than 8 to 11 hours per day. This leads us to the active couch potato phenomenon that's been discussed across the media. This is from a cross-sectional study by Healy et al. that included more than 4,000 individuals who completed the recommended 2.5 hours per week of moderate to vigorous activity. They self-reported physical activity time and TV time. They found a dose-response relationship between TV time and various cardiometabolic markers, such as increased waist circumference, systolic blood pressure, 2-hour plasma glucose, systolic triglycerides, and high-density lipoproteins. All these values were still within normal ranges, but it does support the idea that both physical activity and the duration of sitting time matter. So why should we use some sit-stand solutions, given that both leisure time, physical activity, and occupational time matters? Really, it's because we should have a seat. It's more comfortable. We just shouldn't have a seat for too long. Based on the literature, we know that prolonged standing increases risk for low back and leg discomfort, as well as cardiovascular disease. We also know that increased durations of total sitting time increases risk of cardiometabolic disorders. Therefore, any strategy to reduce total sitting time without increasing risk due to prolonged standing is really warranted. So first of all, standing appears to be a good rest from sitting, particularly for the passive tissues, given the change in lumbar spine posture and the shift in loading of the posture of dependent passive tissues. This graph is from a study done by Callahan et al., and it shows the amount of extension and flexion in the lumbar spine while sitting and standing. The amount of flexion ranges between 30 to 70 degrees, increasing tension on passive tissues in the spine. In standing, the lumbar spine ranges between 10 degrees of extension and 10 degrees of flexion. Although the forces experienced by the joints of the lumbar spine during sitting and standing activities were found to fall well below any traditional single exposure tissue tolerance value, the prolonged static loads could still present a fatigue injury mechanism. And therefore, standing, used alternatively as a rest from sitting, may help prevent the static loads on the passive tissues in the spine due to the slouched sitting posture. The idea of alternating postures may also reduce fatigue and discomfort. A study by Carisa et al. Found that alternating between sitting and standing not only affected lumbar spine flexion, but also corresponded to discomfort in the back without any significant deficit on productivity. A recent meta-analysis, not yet published, by Agarwal et al., found that low back discomfort among non-pain developers was reduced between 0.2 to 3.6 points on a 0 to 10-point scale, with a mean reduction of 0.7 points. A summary by Carisa et al. Summarized that the various benefits identified in the literature of using sit-stand workstations. Essentially, 12 of the 14 studies found at least some benefit to using a sit-stand paradigm. However, unfortunately, there was no established protocol outlining an optimal ratio of sitting time to standing time. For example, in this study by Gallagher, a sit-to-stand ratio of 3:1 did not allow for complete and lasting recovery of low back pain, developed in response to the prolonged standing. So this was 45 minutes of standing to 15 minutes of sitting. And you can see that especially among the pain developers, they really were not able to recover from the 45 minutes of standing. This pattern would also push workers beyond the 4 hours of standing per day. Additionally, in response to the growing obesity epidemic, the World Health Organization has recommended that we increase our daily energy expenditure by 200 kilocalories per day, specifically through non-exercise activity. A study by Levine et al. Measured energy expenditure while performing different levels of light and sedentary activity, such as static sitting, static standing, dynamic sitting or standing, which is the sitting while fidgeting or the standing while fidgeting, as well as walking. Levine showed that fidgeting 2.5 hours per day or walking about 1 hour per day would help meet the World Health Organization recommendation of increasing our energy expenditure by 200 kilocalories per day. Just to be clear, the benefit from alternating between sit and stand workstations is really not based on the caloric expenditure alone. A study by Church et al. Estimated that the decrease in occupation-related energy expenditure is approximately 100 calories per day. And this is something easily reversed by eliminating, say, a soft drink or a juice from your diet. The benefit appears to be related more to LPL, or lipoprotein lipase, which plays a central role in metabolism by mediating the clearance of atherogenic lipoproteins. Therefore, a decrease in LPL results in an increase in triglycerides and HDL, both of which increase one's risk for coronary heart disease. The recommendation of regular moderate exercise is in part due to the increase in LPL that occurs with exercise. Some research by Hamilton and others have shown that local contractile activity is a major determinant of LPL regulation in skeletal muscle. You can see in this graph that the soleus, when immobilized, had a reduction in LPL, and the TA, when stimulated, had an increase in LPL. Clearly, there is an increased muscle activity when standing versus sitting, though activities like walking and stair climbing increase muscle activity and presumably LPL regulation even more. What is less clear is how non-exercise physical activity influences blood pressure. In a study by Graves et al., a group using a sit-stand desk was compared to a control group. And sitting time was reduced by 87 minutes, standing time was increased by 73 minutes, and walking time increased by about 7 minutes. After 8 weeks, there were non-statistically significant reductions in cholesterol, systolic blood pressure, and diastolic blood pressure. This is an area that warrants further research to understand how increasing non-exercise physical activity and perhaps a combination of that with leisure time physical activity can influence some of the cardiometabolic biomarkers associated with cardiovascular disease and obesity associated with prolonged sedentary behavior. So, what do we know about using sit-stand solutions? I think the first thing we need to address is whether or not they're used. Given that the literature indicates that sit-stand workstations are beneficial for facilitating postural variability, and that given the right dose, there may be some improvements in cardiometabolic health, are they even efficacious? Will they be used by workers? A study by Wilkes looked at compliance with sit-stand recommendations and found that although 78% reported that the desk improved their working environment, only 13 to 21% actually reported standing at least once per day. That number improved to 28% among those who were provided instruction. Some of the reasons for not using the standing function of the desk included the table surface being too small when it was in the standing position, the perception that they didn't need it because they were getting sufficient movement and variation of posture throughout their day, the fact that they had pain upon standing, or that they found it was embarrassing to stand when others were sitting around them. However, in other studies, implementing a sit-stand desk did reduce sedentary time by an average of 66 minutes per day, and ergonomics training with 6 days of reminders led to an intervention group standing 3 times per day and reporting lower discomfort and higher job performance. Of note is that the ergonomic training group in the Robertson study reported that their tasks really drove their postural shifts, and it wasn't any kind of reminder notification software that drove their shifts in posture, but more the completion of a task and moving from one task to another. There was an excellent systematic review and meta-analysis on how to reduce workplace sedentary time that was recently published by Chu and colleagues. They found a mean weighted reduction in sitting time from educational and behavioral interventions of 15 minutes per 8-hour day, and a mean weighted reduction of 73 minutes from environmental interventions, such as implementing a sit-stand desk. Interestingly, studies that used multi-component intervention, which included, say, a sit-stand desk and some sort of educational component, reduced sitting time by 88 minutes per 8-hour shift. Despite the promising finding that education and environmental interventions can reduce workplace sitting time, it's possible that it comes at the expense of leisure time physical activity. A study by Mansoub, published last year, found that there was a compensation for decreased sitting time at work with increased sedentary behavior outside of work. So clearly, in order to be effective, the sit-stand stations will need to be utilized during work, and leisure time physical activity will need to be maintained or concurrently increased. Another interesting point to consider is the pattern of sitting. An article by Dunstan compared the sit-stand patterns of individuals and found that the distribution of sedentary time may be just as important as the total duration of sedentary time. Here you can see an example of the prolonger on the left and the breaker on the right. The prolonger has longer periods of sedentary time than the breaker, who is taking more breaks more frequently. And there was a dose-response relationship reported between the number of breaks taken and important metrics like waist circumference, BMI, triglycerides, and 2-hour plasma glucose. So, what next? This was a funny article that was going around on The Onion. Health experts recommend standing up at your desk, leaving office, and never coming back again. Clearly, we know that's not going to work. And there was a nice figure by Owen and colleagues that really outlined what further research is needed in order to really understand this relationship between sedentary behavior and health outcomes, to be able to measure sedentary behavior both in the workplace as well as outside of the workplace, be able to characterize the prevalence and variations of sedentary behavior, as well as identifying the determinants of sedentary behavior. Once we understand a little bit more about what the determinants of sedentary behavior are, we can really start to develop and test complex or multi-component interventions that will influence sedentary behavior both in the workplace as well as out of the workplace. And I think that is where we can use relevant evidence to hopefully inform public health guidelines, both, again, in the workplace and out of the workplace. I think we should consider an individualized approach, meaning what do people's patterns of a day look like? How long do they commute? What do they do at home? What do they do in leisure time? And what do they do for work? How active is their desk job? I think we could all agree that the amount of sitting time per computer-based desk job is not equal day to day, nor is it equal across different types of jobs. We need to understand how to measure more precisely, both in the workplace and out of the workplace, how much sitting there is, how much standing, how much walking, stair climbing, and leisure time physical activity one engages in. Among sitting and standing behavior, it would be interesting to see what the pattern of sitting and standing is, as well as whether it's very static or more dynamic. The percent of time spent in each of these postures or activities might be important to know, as well as the max intervals or durations that people are engaging in each of these postures. And perhaps the patterns of these postures make a difference. From this information, can we identify interventions that not only utilize the environment, such as sit-stand workstations, but and education, but also things like smart cueing or scheduling different postures, incentive-based goal setting, or some sort of gamification to engage different people in meeting their goals. Additionally, we might want to consider job or task-specific strategies. We could understand a little bit better how a specific job or tasks within a job influence postural and activity preferences. Instead of worrying about a specific recipe for how much someone should sit and how much someone should stand, maybe we need to understand how different tasks influence postural activity preferences to improve compliance and adherence to having a more dynamic posture during work. It's possible that there are different preferences for working on the computer versus having a meeting versus taking a conference call. Perhaps the type of computer task, whether someone is reading something, surfing the web, or typing or doing spreadsheet activity, that might dictate whether someone prefers to sit or stand. The type of meeting might also influence someone's preference. It's possible that a 2-person meeting might be different than a 5-person meeting or a 10-person meeting. For conference calls, if the conference call includes video, then it might be more difficult to have one posture over the other. If it's an audio call, maybe that's a good opportunity for someone to be walking. I think of another strategy is to look at the cultural, environmental, or changes in the workplace that could influence preferences. From a cultural standpoint, how can a company facilitate walk and talk meetings or walking breaks, standing meetings, or snail email? This was, for example, a study by Dunstan looked at the impact of 2-minute walks every 20 minutes in overweight individuals. There were brief interruptions to sitting. It was found that brief interruptions to sitting led to significant reductions in postprandial glucose and insulin, irrespective of the activity intensity. So there could be some sort of intervention that includes bursts of different activities, whether it be going up and down the stairs or walking. I think it's also possible that we should look at how interventions are accepted by people in different life stages and take essentially a life stage strategy. This is a figure that shows daily hours and sedentary behavior across the lifespan. And what you see is that activity is increased at different times of someone's stage. And it's possible that, we need to think about interventions that fit for an aging worker versus a worker who is just entering the workforce or a worker who is just starting a family or has childcare responsibilities. Along those lines, perhaps intertwining leisure time physical activity strategies with strategies in the workplace might have the best overall success in reducing risks associated with sedentarism. You can see here the different METs associated with activities everything from walking slowly to walking, hiking more with a higher speed. Things like gardening, shoveling, or playing tennis and jogging could be considered and tracked in maybe a more precise manner. And then we might want to consider environmental strategies, how things like bike shares and bike lanes influence people's sedentary behavior. For example, if bike shares and bike lanes are more accessible, perhaps people can turn their commute time into leisure time physical activity. It's possible that having trails that are safe and easy to walk and talk at the workplace might be one way to facilitate walking during the workday. And there's been an interesting increase in walking school buses. So perhaps working parents that can take the opportunity to participate in a walking school bus by walking their kids to school can help increase the activity both of their children as well as themselves in a given day. And then, of course, there's a variety of options, such as the sit-stand work desk, that can be used to increase or reduce sedentary behavior in the workplace. That is also an important strategy. And of course, keep your eye out for other exciting research. There are numerous scientists that are running large-scale studies that should help us answer many of the questions that we have. This is a group, the Stand and Move at Work in Australia. They are really doing some great work looking at how individual, social, environmental, and organizational aspects influence activity levels and the reduction of sedentary behavior. So I think, in conclusion, this is a problem that really requires multiple components in its intervention, and I think it's something that we're just really starting to understand. Sit-stand desks are certainly one possible solution for reducing sitting time and sedentary behavior, but I think it shouldn't be looked at as an individual intervention and really needs to be implemented with other things like education, like environmental improvements and other strategies that can increase people's activity both at work and outside of work at home. So that's it. At this point, I am happy to take some questions. I think there's a couple of questions that have been posted. Julie, I'm not sure how you want to run the Q&A portion.
Yes, I can read out the question to you, and then maybe if you could answer and until we run out of questions. So the first question we had was, leaving aside the health benefits, is there evidence that standing increases concentration? The person who asked remembered seeing something about a year ago that indicated you couldn't perform complicated thought processes while standing.
Yeah, I think that the type of task that people do while standing, might matter. I think more of that work has been done with like the treadmills, the computer treadmill stations, where it was clear that there were certain tasks that you could do well on a computer treadmill and others that were really difficult. As far as standing goes, I think there's, I'm not sure about exactly what the research says about concentration per se with just sitting versus standing.
Another question that came in is asked about standing mats. How do standing mats impact duration of standing and any discomfort?
I haven't seen very much in regards to standing mats in an office-based environment, although it is indicated in by the Canadian Health Organization as one of the interventions that should be considered for prolonged standing. Really, we see more research on the influence of mats with prolonged standing jobs. I think that having a mat at your standing work desk can certainly be beneficial, but what I'm not sure the evidence really points to standing for really long periods of time. We see that one study by Callahan that had the 45 minutes of standing to the 15 minutes of sitting, and it seems that might be too much standing. So, perhaps for the durations that we're talking about, where sit-stand stations are typically helping people to stand maybe an hour and a half total more per day, it might not be as critical to have, say, a anti-fatigue mat.
Yeah, very. And then another question we have came in. I'm sorry.
One other thing about the mats and discomfort and standing and discomfort, I do think there's more work to be done to look at specific musculoskeletal disorders that people have and their tolerance for standing. So it's possible that there's not or it's likely, I would say, that there isn't a one recipe fits all for individuals, and that depending on whether they have had prior back issues and what types of back issues they have been, people might have different tolerances for that sort of stand ratio that we're trying to get our hands around.
This is a similar question, actually, because it asks, does the research show a benefit to alternating use of a footrest while standing to reduce low back pain or fatigue?
So this is another area that I think we need more work in. I think that, anecdotally, there can be benefits from having a footrest to sort of make your standing posture more dynamic. And I think it appears that any sort of postural variation is a good thing for comfort and reducing discomfort. And it might even encourage fidgeting. And we see that there's there's some research that showed that fidgeting while sitting or fidgeting while standing might actually increase energy expenditure. So I think there's some indications that something like a footrest, particularly maybe a swinging footrest or something of that nature, might have its might be something to look at, but I don't know that we know the answer to that firmly at this point.
This is an interesting question which asks, does the type of sit-stand desk, either electric versus manual, or ease of use of the desk influence the duration that it's used?
I'm trying to think of whether I saw anything concretely from the literature on that. I don't think I can recall specifically what the numbers are as far as compliance on whether electric versus manual, how it affected compliance. I mean, it makes sense to me that the easier it is to actually move it up, the more it's going to be used. But I don't have a differential on number of minutes comparing the two.
Another question is from somebody who says that at their work, they're moving forward to sit-stand workstations, but they wonder about communicating with employees about how much to stand versus sit and what time of physical activity, what amount of time of physical activity should be recommended for outside of work. Yeah,
there's some good information about kind of ranges of standing. I mean, I think what we see from the literature is, I think about an hour to 2 hours is the right amount of standing time, just based on some of the graphs and papers that were presented even in this talk. I think that with some people have looked at a 50 to 50 ratio, so 4 hours of standing to 4 hours of sitting. And I'm not sure we know enough yet about the potential, downfalls, or I should say that, we don't really know what that threshold limit is. And it might be different across people, again, based on some of their individual characteristics, what kind of, back issues they've had in the past, how fit they are, things of that nature. It does appear that, an hour to an hour and a half seems, pretty reasonable, and does have consistent reductions in musculoskeletal discomfort across individuals. So I think that's maybe a good target to start at. I know from some of the things that I've heard, it's, start with an hour and work up to 2. I'm not a big fan of pushing people to 4 hours at this point, just because that's really the maximum amount of standing that is suggested, even for people who are standing, have primarily standing jobs. And again, I'm not sure we are really aware of the thresholds based on people's different individual factors or issues that they have. Let's see. Did that answer that question? What was the other portion of that?
The other. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's the standard. 30 minutes per day is what's been suggested. Obviously, an hour per day, I think, is preferable. I don't. I think even having a walking program would be beneficial. And there's enough literature to kind of, to support that regular walking for periods of time and for leisure physical activity time is important.
This is a related question which asks, if people are able to get up and walk every 20 minutes during their work day, are sit-stand workstations even needed?
I think that's a great question. And I think that until we come up with a device that can provide better individualized information on what people's patterns really are, I'm not sure we can answer that. It's very difficult to assess unless you have a Fitbit on or something of that nature, exactly how much activity you're getting. And certainly even Fitbits don't really help you with sit-stand, how much you're sitting and how much you're standing. So, I'm hoping that in the future there's some devices that come out that are scalable, that can give people real-time information on how much sitting, standing, walking, et cetera, that someone's doing. And that might be able to help inform better purchasing decisions and really focus the sit-stand stations on people who need them, who are really, sitting for long periods of time and maybe have less postural variability in their job. There's certainly people who have a desk-based job or office-based job who actually are moving around quite a bit. So I think those people might not need a sit-stand station because they're getting enough variation through their regular activities.
Another question asks about, can you talk to the latest research on treadmill or bike workstation?
There's been less lately on the treadmills and biking. Again, the treadmills, they take up a lot of space, they're expensive, and I think there's, certain things that people can do pretty well on it, and other things that are more difficult to accomplish on a treadmill station. Probably something, for biking, I think I'm a little less familiar with that intervention, but it really appears that those are going to work for maybe a smaller number of people. Some people who feel that they can work on those devices and still get their work done well. And I think that going towards, postural variability for the rest of the population and figuring out ways that they can intertwine activity in their day might, help the majority.
There's this related question which asks, is there any research with standing and typing in relation to the accuracy of typing or mousing versus being seated and supported while typing or mousing? And actually somebody who also asked, are there any studies on productivity differences from sit-stand workstations?
The literature on productivity has been mixed, with some studies finding improvements in productivity and others finding detriments. So I don't know that there's enough consistency in the literature to really identify whether there's any improvements in productivity with the posture variability. And again, maybe part of that is because we're not looking at it with enough precision with what kind of task is being done, and some of the specifics around the worker. Sorry, what was the first question? The first part of that question?
Yeah, the first part was just about accuracy in regards to typing or mousing in standing versus being well supported when typing and mousing.
Yeah, actually, so there's some great, Jack Dennerlein's been doing a lot of work on the proper setup for standing workstations. So I think we'll be able to get some good information on that soon. It does appear that, the setup might be a little bit different for standing workstations, and having some adjustability of, say, the monitor and where how the rest of the desk is set up, might warrant more consideration than just raising your work surface.
Another person asks about neck discomfort as a variable, and is that not used when looking at standing posture, as if taking into account neck discomfort, it seems to have a good effect on improving overall discomfort?
Yeah, so we actually tried, Shuchi Argawal did a meta-analysis on discomfort or the influence of sit-stand workstations on discomfort. And we actually tried to look at different body regions, and there really wasn't enough consistency across studies to do a meta-analysis on the different body regions. So there was the most consistency in the low back, and so that was one reason why we focused on the low back. It does look like that there, at least for the neck, from what I saw, there were some studies where the neck discomfort decreased, but I think if the workstation is not set up properly in standing, there's potential for upper extremity or neck discomfort to increase. And so I think, again, learning more about, over the next 6 months or so, about the proper setup of the standing workstation is going to be important.
One person asks, should an employee have a medical evaluation to determine suitability for sit-stand workstation use?
Oh, I don't know that I can answer that. I think if there are concerns about the person's health, then it's always a good idea. But there really wasn't anything that I saw in the literature that made specific suggestions about individuals that should not engage in sit-stand activity at work, or we don't know anything about thresholds for different people based on their maybe comorbidities. So I think that is an area that, we need to look into more in the future, as far as that area. I think all I could say at this point is that there have been a couple studies that implemented sit-stand workstations successfully with, say, an obese population. I haven't seen any studies that focus on this type of intervention for people who have any other sort of comorbidities that are maybe more severe.
Another person comments that they feel they have a better posture when their desk is in the standing mode, and it's good for them ergonomically. What do you think about this?
I think I would go back to, I'm not sure how I can do this most effectively quickly, but if you go back to some of Callahan's work on, here we go, postural variability, you'll see that, actually maybe I can even get a pen here. I mean, the reason I think they're feeling that way is because in standing, you're in this, 10 to 10 degrees. So 10 degrees of extension to neutral to 10 degrees in the sagittal plane, a position or a posture. And so you do look more like this vertebra right here. Whereas the sitting, it's easy to relax and sort of hang in your passive tissues, meaning the ligaments, the posterior ligaments on the spine. And so we see, a larger amount of flexion. And so, I would agree that typically, the lumbar spine posture is often better in standing. The problem is that there's other, detriments to that as far as the same postural muscles being on for long periods of time, and some other issues with prolonged standing as well. So it's good for your body to have a break, and I think that balance of sitting to standing is important.
People are asking if you're willing to share the PowerPoint presentation after the webinar, and wondered.
I think that's up to you guys. So I think it's going to be on, right? It's going to be posted, and so you can click on a link and
yes,
and watch it again if you want. So no problem.
Yes, for those who are signing up for CE credit, they would be able to access a recording of the webinar, but we could also save a PDF of the slides if you're comfortable with that too.
Sure.
Okay. I think this is our final question, which asks, is there any research regarding wearing high-heeled shoes during standing?
Oh, I did not look at that for this webinar. I couldn't answer as far as research goes. I mean, I can certainly say, as in my clinical days, that was the first thing we told people to change if they had pain with standing, was to make sure they were in flatter shoes. So I can certainly, I'm not sure what the evidence says, but I do think it has an impact.
I was wondering if there was any research on the effect of job stress on the effectiveness of sit-stand, or is that something still needing to be looked at?
That's a good question. Again, we really haven't looked at the interaction of psychosocial stress and and how it impacts the association, say, between sit-stand workstations and either compliance, meaning the amount of sedentary time, or the effectiveness of the postural variability. So I think the one thing that I really want to make sure, or at least the most important thing to me in reviewing this literature, is that although sit-stand desks are a good strategy to reduce sitting time at work, I don't think that it's enough alone. Maybe we don't quite know the answer to that, but it really seems like a multi-component approach to reducing some sitting time at work, improving choices for leisure time outside of work, getting that physical activity in. And I think with people's busy schedules these days, it's really hard to just say, go and exercise 30 to 60 minutes a day. I think we need to be creative and also finding ways that people can access or fit in physical activity in their day, whether it be by commuting or at work or with other responsibilities like taking the kids to school. So I personally hope that we see a lot of growth in devices that allow us to provide better information to individuals to make better decisions, as well as make research easier, and by making the exposure essentially more precise. And I also hope that we can really explore things like how stress influences choices that people are making, as well as the actual improvements that we potentially will see in the interventions that we're using. So I think it's an exciting time. There's a lot that we know, but there's also a lot that we have yet to discover.
Well, thank you so much. Just we're getting questions coming in again saying so how long should you sit and how long should you stand before you're... I showed one slide that talked about how 45 minutes of standing to 15 minutes of sitting was probably too long. There's a study going on right now, but the findings are not published yet, that is comparing sort of different ratios of sit to stand time. So I think that'll be exciting to get the results from that study. I don't have them yet, and it's not my group that is doing that research. But that should be coming out soon, and I think that'll answer that question. I still think that even when we know what is the best ratio, say, or recipe, we still have another question to answer, which is, can people actually implement that ratio easily, or is it too disruptive to their work? And how can we understand more about what people like to do in different postures so that we can help them make better decisions about when they sit and stand? So I think that the recipe piece, or the proportion of time that people are sitting and standing in, say, a given hour, is an important question, but it's not going to be the final question that's going to really help in reducing sedentary time at work. Thank you. And I know you did answer the question about whether an employee should have a medical evaluation, and really that was something that was probably dependent upon the individual's own health status, and that most of the studies were done in people who were healthy. So we couldn't really give a definitive answer on that. Is that correct?
On how much standing is appropriate for people with comorbidities?
Oh, yeah, and whether an employee should actually have a medical evaluation to determine if it's suitable for them to use a sit-stand workstation.
Yeah, I really can't answer that. The only thing I would say is if there's any concerns, or someone does have some serious comorbidities, that they likely should go and talk to their doctor about that type of intervention, just like they would for any exercise program.
Yes. Well, at that point, I would like to say thank you so much to our presenter, Dr. Harris-Adamson, for a wonderful presentation. I feel like we all learned so much today. And thank you to everybody who joined us, participated in today's webinar. If you wish to take it for credit, please register at our coehce.org website, and you can complete also the online evaluation that you'll be sent with the link when you register. Also, everyone who got a ReadyTalk confirmation for today's webinar will have a link in that to be able to complete the evaluation. If you would like to give us your feedback, we'd much appreciate it. Next month, on April 5th at 10:30 a.m., we're very pleased to have Erica Garcia from UC Berkeley, who will be presenting an overview of occupational epidemiology and the healthy worker effect. So hopefully you will be able to join us again on the first Wednesday of next month. Thank you all very much for joining us. We'll end the meeting.